Okay. It's got to go through 100%, so it's we're live. So welcome back. Hopefully everyone had a bit of a break. And if I can have everyone mute their lines while they're not speaking, I'm getting some feedback on this end. This next session is comprised of 4 presentations, followed by a brief panel discussion on partnering with patient advocacy groups and creating meaningful patient engagement across the drug development continuum. Leading and facilitating this discussion will be Helen Kellar-Wood, our patient and site engagement strategy lead in global development operations at Bristol Myers Squibb. As a reminder, please post any questions that you may have in the chat area, and I will now turn it over to Helen.
Thank you, Kathy, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who's joined this conference. Thank you for coming today, and we're really excited about this day of learning and sharing. So I am going to start our presentation on partnering with patient advocacy and patient-facing organizations to really create a meaningful experience for patients. And I'm going to start this, if I can just share my content. And I'm hoping you can see this slide, because this weekend we lost a great advocate. The world lost a great advocate. And I chose this quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg because to me it really spoke to what is at the core of being an advocate and how we need to work together. It really spoke to the partnership. So I just like one person to confirm that they're seeing the slide. I'm hoping that's the end. Thank you, Kathy. That's great. So, you know, we fight for things that we care about, but we do that in a way that's going to engender everybody to join, lead others to join you. And that's really at the core of partnership and collaboration. So when we think about how pharmaceutical companies partner to hear about patients, really, you know, this has had a bit of a checkered history. And for many years, the viewpoints of patients and their caregivers was not always considered. And in fact, what sometimes happened is that sponsors of clinical studies spoke to doctors, and doctors were used, and the medical profession was used almost as a surrogate for the patient voice. And of course, we know that, you know, that thankfully, that situation has changed. And over the last 10 years or so, many sponsor companies have really embraced the opportunity to share and find out the patient perspective, try to bring that patient perspective into clinical studies. And really, we can do that through the many opportunities along the drug development cycle that are shown on this slide here. So these are opportunities to embed that patient perspective right into the process that we use for clinical development. So, and the best way to do that is to talk to patients and their caregivers. And we can do that through interacting and building sustained relationships with advocacy organizations, with patient-facing organizations and community groups. And this slide really shows many of the points at which we can understand the value of partnership, the value of the patient perspective, and embed that into the process. So whether that's understanding the burden of disease and what's important to patients as we design our clinical studies, to having input and review of the protocol design, thinking about how we optimize the study, how we consider operationalizing the study, thinking about our investigator meetings. Do we need that? How can we bring that patient voice to the beginning of the study? And thinking about informed consent. What should that look like? How can we make that more understandable and communicate that more effectively to the patient? And then how can we engage and communicate and keep people interested and retain them on the study? And then, of course, as we've heard from the last speaker, the post-study communications and the feedback and reporting out is hugely important too. So today, to begin our conversation on partnership, I'm going to introduce some friends and great speakers that we have today. So I'll introduce them, and as Kathy said, we're going to have 4 presentations from each of these speakers, and then we're going to sit down and have a good discussion about partnership and what makes that so special. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Sue Friedman. Sue is the executive director of the organization FORCE, which stands for Facing Our Risk of Cancer Empowered. And FORCE's mission is to improve the lives of and families affected by hereditary cancers. And Sue's a 24-year breast cancer survivor herself, and she was diagnosed very early on. And this journey really led Sue to begin and initiate forming FORCE as an organization. And then we're going to also, I'd like to introduce Dyan Bryson, who's CEO of Inspired Health Strategies and Patient Engagement Strategies. And since 2010, this organization has been helping the life science industry really put the patient at the center of everything they do. And Sue is a industry veteran and has had a lot of over 30 years experience with client and supplier on that side of the business, and is also a survivor herself and really helping to bring change. Then from the non-oncology space, we have Catherine Soto, who is the Director of Patient Education and Support for the Crohn's and Colitis organization. And in her role, she oversees the development of the education programs for adults and pediatric patients. And then finally, we have Bryan McMahon, who is himself a 4-time cancer caregiver himself, and also the founder of SparkCures. And SparkCures is a patient engagement platform built for multiple myeloma patients and enables them to really connect with specialists and find out more about clinical trials around the US and globally. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sue to begin with, and for Sue to share her presentation this morning. So thank you very much.
And Helen, if you can please stop sharing so Sue can share her screen, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, great. There we go. Thank you.
Okay, there we go. Share file. Okay. Bear with me a second. Oh, let's see. I guess this is it. Okay, I already had it queued up. Hang on. I apologize. I'm going to share my screen instead. And it is, okay, good. Okay. So thank you, everyone. I think this is the wrong presentation. I so apologize.
No worries.
And of course, oh, everything just when you, maybe it's not. We'll see. Okay, well, I'm going to go with this one then anyway. And all right, good morning. We'll see how this goes. So I have no conflicts to disclose. And as Helen said, I'm the founder and executive director of Facing Our Risk of Cancer Empowered. And our mission is really to improve the lives of people affected by hereditary cancers. So this means people affected by an inherited gene mutation. And, I'm going to talk about something that kind of cuts across all the different stages of the research life cycle to affect patients. And that is the use of jargon. And so why do words matter? This is something we think about a lot at Force because we're communicating about cancer and genetics, and it's actually pretty complicated. There's a lot of opportunities for people to misunderstand. And through the years, one of the things that we found consistently is that jargon is cited by patients as a barrier to access to information and participation in clinical trials. And also that jargon is cited by healthcare providers as a barrier to referring patients to clinical trials. And I'll give you an example. In 2016, we did a survey of patients who had and had not participated in clinical research. And of the 536 patients who said that they had participated in clinical research, a large portion of them indicated that understanding the study description strongly influenced their decision to participate. Another 20% said that it moderately affected their decision to participate. So understanding what it is they're being asked to do is really important. Within that same effort, we did some focus groups, and this was an example, putting up the eligibility for the participants and asking them if they thought they would qualify for this clinical trial. And this was a quote from one of the people who participated saying, I'd have to have a medical degree to understand whether or not I'm eligible for a trial. And then recently, we actually were in the process of doing a needs assessment to look at things that look at the different barriers and facilitators to referral for a lot of different services by healthcare professionals. And one of the things that we did find was that jargon and health literacy were cited as one of the top 3 barriers to referral to clinical trials. And by 61% of the community health workers that we surveyed, 41% of the oncology nurse navigators, and 21% of genetic counselors. So again, it's clearly a barrier. And Force was not the only organization to find this, and we were really fortunate to be asked to participate in this large collaboration that is being spearheaded by Longevity, which is a lung cancer advocacy organization. And they brought together a lot of stakeholders for something they call the Consistent Testing Terminology Working Group. And if you look, it's not just advocacy and patient-facing organizations that have come to the table, but also professional society and industry partners. And this is really important because one of the goals was for us to reach consensus on certain terms that we use when we're talking about terminology that relates to tumor testing and what we call germline genetic testing, or genetic testing for an inherited mutation. So we know genetic testing can really affect people's medical decisions and participation and eligibility in clinical trials, and yet it's really an underutilized service. And then there's also tumor testing, and it can also influence people's eligibility and participation in clinical trials, as well as access to clinical services. And again, there's a lot of confusion there. And there's a lot of confusion between the two, because some of the tumor testing is looking at things like somatic mutations or acquired mutations in a tumor versus germline mutations or inherited mutations that someone was born with. And there's a lot of overlap between the two, and there's a lot of confusion by patients. So part of this effort of this collaborative group was to see if we could reach consensus. And we started by kind of doing a landscape of all the different terms that we used when we were talking about tumor testing and genetic testing in cancer. We came up with about 33 terms across 9 disease spaces. And it probably would have been more than that, but at some point we had to cut it off, because the point was that there's a lot of different terms. Many are being used to describe the same thing. And so through a series of meetings, and all of the stakeholders participating, we decided that one of our goals would be to reach consensus on one umbrella term, which could then be drilled down into or qualified with different descriptors. And as a group, we decided that biomarker testing would be the umbrella term that we use for testing of tumors and cancer products that were not due to an inherited mutation. And that was huge because, I mean, there were a lot of stakeholders involved, and we all used different terms, and we all pretty much agreed to start trying to use that same term of biomarker testing. We could not reach a consensus on the preferred term for what we call germline genetic testing. So this is testing for an inherited mutation. There were a lot of reasons why this can be decided upon, but this is an area where there's a lot of confusion. And so what we decided to do was do a patient survey and see what patient preferences were, because we really didn't know if patients really understood what these terms meant and if they had a preference with regard to what the test would be called. So we asked them, and we got across the different groups. So the advocacy groups all deployed this survey to patients, and we had a robust response of over 1,600 individuals. And there was really a preference for two different terms: genetic testing for an inherited mutation and genetic testing for inherited cancer risk. We did ask about some of the other terms, like genetic testing for a germline mutation, which is a term that is being used in germline mutation, meaning inherited, something someone was born with. And it's interesting because the survey was taken pre-COVID. And so we closed the survey in February, but we got a lot of comments, and a lot of what we heard was it's not plain language. The other thing that we heard is germline sounds like it has germ in it. It sounds like something you can catch, something you don't inherit. Or bacteria, other people said. And what was also interesting is that we had patients who thanked us for asking them. So it turns out that, they don't get asked a lot. So based on that preference, the patient preference survey, the working group decided that we would use each of us agreed to use one or two different terms: genetic testing for an inherited mutation and genetic testing for inherited cancer risk as the preferred umbrella term among all the organizations. We also asked about preference for genetic test results. Right now, the scientific community favors the term pathogenic variant, but most people understand inherited gene mutation. And again, we got a similar response. People like inherited gene mutation. They felt it was plain language. They do not like pathogenic variant. Again, pre-COVID, but for the same reasons that, it sounds like an infection. And so, it's important for us to work together to agree on language and even to ask patients with regard to their preference. The adoption of a common term for the genetic test results was beyond the scope of the working group. However, FORCE as an organization has decided whenever possible, we will use the term inherited gene mutation, as well as letting all stakeholders know that that is the preferred term by patients, so that we can all start to work together to adopt common language. So these are some of the products from the Consistent Testing Terminology Working Group. You can find their information in the white paper and infographic and all the other efforts that we've achieved together at commoncancertestingterms.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sue. That's fantastic. Dana, please start your presentation and welcome.
Hi, and I am getting started. Let's see, do the share. And share screen. Yes. Okay. So yes, I would ask the same thing of my panelists, my co-panelists, if you can let me know that you can see my screen. I'd appreciate it.
We can see.
Great. So I am Dyan Bryson with Inspired Health Strategies. And I have to say at the top, Helen, you gave me more credit than I deserve. If I'm a survivor, but I'm a survivor of trying to help the industry truly become patient-centered, honestly. It has been more of a challenge than I had ever expected. So what I do, I work with a group of people that help to focus on the industry, developing strategies and initiatives to help the industry put the patient at the center, put the people at the center. We have been practicing the principles of patient-focused drug development well before the guidance was even introduced. We do this through both manual and well, not so much face-to-face these days, but personal initiatives, as well as through a platform that helps to collect information from people depending on their level of opt-in. We utilize this platform and I want to go back to something even that Sue was just talking about. We can utilize this platform to help to create an ongoing conversation so that people can agree or not, or understand what the common terminology should be. We can use the platform to help people manage their health better. We've learned that in COVID, people who have underlying health conditions, which they probably did not take very seriously before, like a diabetes or obesity or hypertension, they've now learned that they really need to take this very seriously. So they want to manage their health better. And we want to help them do that through this technology. And we think we can do that through we can use this technology to also help to improve the rate of diversity that's presently in clinical trials. And so we do this, we do handle both tactics the same way, in that we partner with a sponsor, like a pharmaceutical company, like BMS. And we work in tangent with the patient advocacy groups, like many in the audience here today, as well as other community-based organizations that simply have the level of trust that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't currently have. And that's what it's really going to take to bridge this level of trust so that people will feel more comfortable, more confident in participating in clinical trials. History has not helped us in that way. And as many of you know in this audience, I probably do not have to do much of an education here for you. But we need to help the pharmaceutical industry build sustainable relationships with people so that they, again, feel comfortable. We know that through our platform, we can help to educate people about clinical trials. We can help them, again, manage their health better. We can create a bond, a better relationship between people and the pharmaceutical industry so that when, again, with the appropriate opt-in, we can eventually recruit people for these clinical trials. Now I'm going to talk about something that usually is pretty crass to talk about. But I have to say that as I have pushed this rock up the hill of trying to help the industry become more patient-centered, I've had to really talk to companies about their business and why for their business this is important. It's not just an altruistic thing. So this is an example, a real life example of a company with whom I worked that was doing a clinical trial on a rare disease. And they were having a hard time recruiting patients for the trial. They couldn't understand why. So they asked me to take a look, and I did. And come to realize, I think I was the first person on the team that even realized that this rare disease was impacting the African-American population more than anyone else. So then I took a look at where the clinical trial sites were. And of course, they were in the highly academic centers that in some places, a Black person didn't even live within 100 miles. So I put together a plan to do what today is probably called, this is 6 years ago, today it's probably called a decentralized clinical trial, where I partnered the academic institutions with community-based institutions so that we could put these two together, get the right patients involved. That plan was going to cost $150,000. The pharmaceutical company said, it's okay. We're not really sure we really want to spend that kind of money. We're going to continue with our trial. And so they did. They continued with their recruitment. And this was a phase 2 trial. And as many of you already know, for phase 2, that's where most drugs for rare diseases are approved. They only had to recruit 100 people. So they did get the recruitment. They took their data to the FDA. And the FDA said, okay, great data, wrong demographic. You're going to have to go back and do a phase 3 trial with the right demographic. So today, 6 years later, that company is now recruiting for that phase 3 trial. They need to recruit 300 people instead of 100. And of course, the costs have mounted because you're looking at phase 3 instead of phase 2. And then the drug should be approved by 2022. And in that time, from 2014 to 2022, they lost the opportunity of $7 billion revenue, let alone the impact, the positive health outcomes that could have been generated if that drug had been on the market for this disease. So again, this is a lesson the company has, I see that the company has learned. It's utilized community-based sites along with the academic centers, but this is an expensive lesson. But this is the kind of information that does help companies wake up and say that we really need to make our clinical trials more diverse. So I have collaborated, talked to you about WAVE work, talked to you about our platform a bit. And I just want to say thank you. And I should have even said that more at the top. I'm so glad to be here. It's interesting listening to the panelists and listening. I'm looking forward to interacting with you in the networking sessions during the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dyan. That's a very important fact for us to consider and take forward. So let's move forward. Let's pause on some questions, but thank you for sharing that. And we'll move to Catherine. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you here today, and I'm very honored to be sharing on behalf of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation the work that we've been doing to address the need to be more patient-centric in terms of encouraging discussions around clinical trials. So I'm very fortunate and thankful to be here with you today. I'm going to start sharing my screen. All right. Share and likewise, I also just need a confirmation that my screen is visible.
Yes, it is. Thanks, Catherine.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. So the clinical trials community is an initiative of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. And my role is to, I work very closely with our team in strategizing for how we make this a very patient-centric approach to ensure that patients understand and have at their grasp the information and tools that they need to understand clinical trials and what's available to them. Just very quick reminder that the mission of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation is to cure Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, two very chronic diseases, and to improve the quality of life of children and adults affected by these diseases. So this very much falls in line with our mission. We all know the importance of clinical trials. In inflammatory bowel disease, there's the same value. Researchers can test these treatments on individuals that have inflammatory bowel disease, which leads to generating data and information to understand safety and effectiveness of a treatment, an intervention, or just a better understanding of the diseases at hand. And then patients have an understanding that the only way that they can access these treatments that can help impact the outcomes of their potentially of their disease is through these approved treatments. So they understand that there is a process that takes place, but their overall deep level detailed understanding may be lacking because there's so much confusion around clinical trials and so much misunderstanding. As an organization, one of the first things we did before we tackled building any resource was to understand the barriers to participation. And we did that through multiple focus groups, both with healthcare professionals and patients and even caregivers. Overall, and this is not surprising or unique really in the IBD space, but confirmation that there are a few barriers that are really getting in the way of patients really having more participation. One, misunderstanding of clinical trials and what what is entailed, the time commitment involved, fear of adverse side effects, and fear of being on a placebo. Engagements with primary GIs, some patients and healthcare providers felt that there was a missing aspect of that experience of staying in touch with their primary gastroenterologists. So that was important to patients, to providers, and to everyone. And that engagement was valued. And the impact on work and family. So this overall were some of the barriers to the participation. And so we approached the clinical trials community in a three-part way. Our goal, after assessing all the needs, was to accelerate the development of new treatments and new treatment options for IBD patients by increasing awareness of clinical trials and educating them about the benefits of participation through what we have built now called the clinical trials community. And the clinical trials community addresses three different areas. Education. So as I mentioned, people had a surface level understanding of what a trial was, but there was some fear, right? There was some fear and some trepidation in really entering it because of the unknown. So our tactic was to educate patients through a series of videos that featured patient testimonials and also educational pieces. Infographics and in-person events that highlighted an education around clinical trials, as well as social media campaigns to spread those resources. Awareness, so we encourage local promotion of our trial finder, which I'll talk about in a moment, and GI outreach. So we, as an organization, ensured that we reached our GI professionals to encourage them to really talk to patients about trials and share our own resources, one of which is our trial finder that allows patients to find IBD-specific trials. And then support. So we have peer-to-peer programs and an ambassador program that allows patients to connect with another patient. And we also have a staff that are dedicated to this aspect. Our clinical trials finder and featured research, there are two different ways that patients can learn about trials. The IBD clinical trials finder allows patients to find trials that are on clinicaltrials.gov, but as the presenters before me mentioned, the jargon can be very, very overwhelming. So our goal is to make it easier for patients to find what they're looking for. So this tool helps do that. And featured research is a way that we partner with industries to allow them to share the resources, the trials, the studies that are available that they're offering in their areas. Another wonderful feature is our clinical trials ambassador program. We have a series, we have a total of about 40 ambassadors that have been trained by the foundation to share their personal stories as it relates to clinical trials. And in their role, their primary objective is not to prescribe at all a trial, but to encourage patients to talk to their providers about trials and see if it's a right fit for them. Often when in inflammatory bowel disease, many patients aren't introduced to clinical trials early enough. And so it ends up that many patients are not eligible to participate in trials because they've waited too long, they've tried more aggressive treatments that perhaps may be a limitation. So while we are trying our best to advance the design of trials and really put our efforts forward in that area, at the moment, we want to ensure that patients talk to their providers as early as possible about the trials that they may be eligible for. And so the ambassador's role is to really put that forward in their engagements with professionals, with patients, and to encourage those conversations. Our support resources span just our dedicated staff to help assist patients, and as we have a help center that where we accept emails and calls, and we receive all kinds of communication requiring information. And so we assist patients that call us and walk them through what resources we have so that they can understand it better. And so we have various resources we guide patients to that help them discuss trials with their providers, and questions that have been developed and approved by patients and research coordinators. As we develop these resources, we had buy-in and participation from patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals. Just a quick note on featured research and patient perspectives. These are the ways that we partner currently within the clinical trials community specifically to allow for a greater engagement with our patients. And so we do this through sharing the studies that are available through e-communications and e-newsletters, social media, having the opportunity to engage on our local front. And also, our patient perspectives are often brought in to weigh in on materials. Is this patient friendly? Can we have participation in advisory boards and bring in that patient perspective, have patients sitting at the table with researchers, with healthcare professionals, with industry to really hear what the patient needs are in the community. And with that, I just wanted to acknowledge my staff and my colleagues, Jamelia, Paul, and Catherine Dermody, who are, as I mentioned, the clinical trials team that we work with to help patients, guide them through all those resources. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much, Kat. That was very, very interesting. Wonderful to hear how you are partnering with your patients and supporting their education. So now our final panelist is Brian, who is from SparkCures. So Brian, all yours. Thank you.
Helen, thank you so much. It's great to be here with everybody today. As Helen mentioned earlier, my name is Brian. I'm with SparkCures. We provide personalized support to multiple myeloma patients around the U.S. And what that means is we help myeloma patients find, understand, and connect with clinical trials and myeloma specialists. Now, we are looking at expanding into other indications, other cancers. Right now, we're specifically focused on myeloma in the U.S. And part of that is I want to talk through the genesis of the company. And really, this all began with my mother, who was diagnosed with multiple myeloma back in 2005. Now, when she was diagnosed, they caught it late, and she had 2 high-risk genetic mutations. So the prognosis we received at diagnosis was not very good. The doctors gave her 30 days, even with treatment. Now, the difference is my mom was a 30-plus year oncology nurse at the time who was working at Amgen. She was a clinical support specialist on the Neupogen and Neulasta team. So my mom had the industry experience and the connections to navigate and find clinical trials. Within 2 weeks, we had her enrolled in a clinical trial at the University of Arkansas. And the difference is that clinical trial gave my mom 2 years with myeloma before she ultimately passed away. And what we like to say is it wasn't the outcome that we wanted, right? But we were given 30 days and we got 2 years. And it really opened up my eyes to the importance of clinical research and what that looks like. Now, in a 10-year period, I was either the primary caregiver or part of the primary caregiving team on 4 different occasions. My mom was the only one to go into a clinical trial. And we started SparkCures with the premise that you shouldn't have to be a 30-plus year oncology nurse with industry connections and working for a pharmaceutical company in order to participate in a clinical trial. And it's our experiences as caregivers first that led us to start SparkCures. And it's feedback from patients as we continue to work with them that has helped us to put patients at the center of all that we do. And what we want to talk about is, over the past 5 years, we've helped connect thousands of patients to clinical trials and specialists across the US. And this is actually something that we had put together, we had commissioned at the office. We call it our Jiminy Cricket moment, where we want to put patients first. And it's this great reminder that everything we do has to be patient-centric. And we've taken a different approach when it comes to clinical trial participation and awareness and engagement. And that's that we think it's not about recruitment, it's about relationships. We work with patients for years, some who never go into a clinical trial, some who are on their 3rd, 4th, 5th clinical trial at this point. And in the spirit of putting patients first, what I want to do is share 3 brief stories of patients that we've worked with. We want to put their voice to the forefront here to showcase the difficulties and challenges that patients face, that families face, and that we face when helping to navigate clinical trials. Now, in industry terms, we started our preclinical development of SparkCures 5 years ago. And the way we did this was we brought a myeloma nurse navigator on board, and we started reaching out to myeloma patients around the US. And our calls went, we think there's a better way to help navigate these clinical trial options for myeloma patients. Will you come on and help us? And the very first patient that we ever matched with, they came on, and our control side of this is that we would use clinicaltrials.gov is a basis that we could gauge ourselves off of. And in the meantime, we were building out our own proprietary data set from clinicaltrials.gov, from hospitals, and we were building out this data set and cleaning it up. Now, when we put this patient through for the first time, they received 158 clinical trials. Now, with the nurse navigator, we went through and we requested all the medical records. So we knew the patient treatment history, we knew the most recent labs, and we combed through every clinical trial with the inclusion and exclusion criteria that was publicly available. And it took us 4 days. And over those 4 days, we were able to get this down to 15 clinical trials. It's a 91% reduction in clinical trials. We thought that was great. And then we started calling those 15 clinical trials, and we just wanted to find out, are they still open and accepting patients? And we had some questions about that on the patient's behalf. And we called and we called and we called. And we heard things like, who are you? How did you get my phone number? What do you mean a clinical trial? And all told, it took us 10 days until we'd heard back from those 15 trials. And out of those 15 trials, 9 had either never opened up or had shut down a long time ago. So there wasn't 158, there wasn't 15, there was 6 options we were going to put in front of that patient. Right? This was very eye-opening for us, because in the midst of a relapse, in the midst of a diagnosis, who's going to have the wherewithal, the energy, right, the sophistication, the medical knowledge, and able to sort through and limit this down? Clinical trials are difficult to find. And even if you can find clinical trials, navigating your clinical trial options is difficult as well. It's why we not only partner with patients and pharmaceutical companies, but we also work very closely with hospitals and physicians. The second patient story is that we have someone we've been working with for a number of years, which is not uncommon for us. And they had been exploring clinical trials, but had not participated in one. Well, about 3 months ago, they found one through our service, through SparkCures, that they were interested in. It was at their center of care, and they started calling. And they were calling and calling. They were leaving voicemails. They weren't hearing anything back. After 2 months, they reached out to us. And they said, we're not really sure what to do. We've been calling. It was their own center. They thought they'd be able to quickly get through this process. Now, we were working with that center, fortunately, so we had an idea of who to connect with, and we got them right over. And within 2 weeks from the time they contacted us, they were enrolled in that clinical trial. They just started about a week and a half ago. So even when a clinical trial is occurring at your center, this trial was never presented to them. It was never discussed at any of the appointments. And they still had a hard time navigating that, even after they were aware of it and understood it and wanted to ultimately participate. Now, the third story, we like to call a frog on a lily pad. And we had a patient who once shared with us a story. He said, I feel like I'm a frog on a lily pad. And we said, what does that mean? And he said, well, in myeloma, treatments will stop working at some point. And he said, I'm a frog sitting on a lily pad, and I always need to make sure I have another lily pad to jump to. And by working with you guys, I'm making sure there's always 2 or 3 lined up, almost like an insurance policy. And we really love this analogy because it's not a moment in time. This is a journey. And that's why they're building the relationships and being patient-centric is so important. We have another patient who we've been working with again for years. They've been on some clinical trials, some standard of care, and that changed in December of last year. They started to relapse. So we put in front of them on December 23rd, 2019, we put 4 trials in front of this patient. 2 at their local center. It was a major academic research center. 1 that was 20 minutes away and 1 that was 4 hours away. And I can tell you today that on September 16th, 2020, this patient received the study drug for the very first time. That's 9 months. 9 months from the time we put this in front of them until they ultimately enrolled and started participating in that study. And in that 9-month period, we had 55 connection points with that patient, 38 phone calls, and 17 emails. This is about building relationships and helping patients through this. We like to call it alphabet soup. There's these things, we talk about terminology and patient-friendly information. There's targets like BCMA and CD38 and SLAM-F7 and antibody drug conjugates and bispecifics. And people don't understand even where to begin this conversation with their doctors. Right? Every trial has a story to tell, and patients want to understand that story. Now, we can tell the story in a bunch of different ways. You can tell it through criteria, right? Through the trial's inclusion and exclusion criteria. But the challenge is some trials will mask that criteria. So they'll say measurable disease is required. Well, in myeloma, there's many ways that you can determine or establish measurable disease. Or they'll say sufficient renal function. Well, does that mean creatinine clearance at 30, at 50, at 60? We need to understand this because our matching is only as good as the data, right? We also need to look at unmasking trial locations. So instead of saying study location 10136, we need to know where that's participating, who the PI is, who the study coordinator is, and when those changes occur at the center, which we know that happens fairly frequently, how do we get access to timely and accurate information? We need patient-friendly information so that patients can better understand these trials. It's all about setting expectations, because patients will not know to ask for the schedule of events, but they're going to want to know logistically what is required of them. What will they have to do? Will they be hospitalized for the first 5 days? Is it like a CAR T where the burden of the trial was really in the first month and a half to 2 months, and then it really opens up? Can they receive care locally or do lab draws locally if they're traveling a far way to be able to participate? These are all things we need to look at. And what I want to say is this is all about putting the patients at the center of this, right? Clinical trials are hard to find. They're hard to navigate. So we need to look at, instead of recruitment, we need to look at building relationships with patients. And what I want to say is I really appreciate everybody who's here, because my mother, we got 2 years with my mom because of the research, patients, and everybody that came before here. And we're all working towards the same goal. So we appreciate that. And we want to look forward to what are better ways that we can partner to include patients earlier in this process through ad boards and taking a look at protocol development. And those are things we hope we can talk through here. This is my personal email, my personal cell phone number, and our website. Please feel free to reach out. You can contact me directly. And we're looking forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was an amazing presentation, and thank you for sharing those examples with us. Really greatly appreciated. All the presenters today, you've really shared amazing ways in which you reach out to your patient partners and membership and constituents to understand their needs and their preferences, and then you partner with sponsor companies and other sites and other ways in which, other organizations to really ensure that this information is put to the best use. So what I'd like to ask is, as the switch now to the panel discussion. So, are there novel ways to partner? And Brian, I know that, just for example, I know that you have had some outreach to clinical sites as well. You obviously do a huge amount for patients, but I'd love to hear examples from all of you, or any of you, to how do you partner with other organizations? What is novel and new? Don't know if anybody wants to jump in.
This is Kat.
You want to find...
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Kat. I just wanted to clarify. You want to know how we what novel ways we partner with various organizations?
Yes,
I do think that's important. What I've learned, I'm amazed at pharma how usually we are so siloed. We don't talk to each other. We don't share a lot. And I find that when I've worked with community-based organizations or patient advocacy groups, they are usually focused so much on doing their work that they don't always have time to work together, or they don't have, or especially the community-based organizations don't have the wherewithal to let anybody else know what work they're doing. So we think it is important to pull them together. I've worked on projects where we have pulled together different organizations that, as a matter of fact, I watched them as they sit in a room. We were doing some market research, and all these people in this one location had always wanted to talk to each other, didn't have time. And they wanted to use the market research, the focus group, to do that. And I finally had to tell the facilitator, time's up. We have to get them going, because consistently with those meetings, the people just had so much to share. So I do think it's important. I think that when we work, my organization works with both the CBOs and the patient advocacy groups. We try to connect them as much as possible. We know that through our technology, they can do that. We insist on building a community so that they can freely do that. And it's, again, according to the opt-in, as to how much they can share, how much they can work together, talk together there in that community.
Thank you, Dyan.
This is Kat. So same.
Finally, since I.
Yeah. So same with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. I think, for instance, a lot of the areas and gaps that we're hearing, they're very similar across many disease states. And so when we did, for instance, our conjoint analysis, those focus groups that I talked about, we started with leveraging what has already been done in the work of some other organizations. So, for instance, we had some of the focus groups were completed by the CIS-CRP in the work that they've done in those areas. So I think it's important to, as we're doing today, listening to all the gaps in different areas and seeing that there's common ground. But I think taking that step to understand the nuances, of course, of every disease state and why getting to the right trial at the right time is so important and can be life-saving for many patients, is something that is a conversation that needs to continuously occur. So it has to, bringing people to the table, bringing industry partners to the table to understand the value of the patient perspective, our role to bring them in and have a seat, as I mentioned, at the table. That's the power that we have, is to leverage our patient voices so that there can be more inclusion of that as there are protocols designed, or as there are ways that we can ensure that they're being reached and not missing any underserved or other patient groups that may be essentially missing these important resources.
Thank you, Pat. And Brian, I know that you have partnered with some clinical sites. Would you be able to share how you've managed that as an organization?
Yeah, it's been really interesting, Helen. It's a great question, because we're finding that a lot of times when we go in there, they're saying that this is a first, right? So we're kind of navigating the legal and compliance complexities of working with hospitals and going through them. For us, it all becomes, how do we get access to their IIT, their investigator-initiated trials? And really, for us, speed is so critical, right? If a patient contacts us in that example I shared, how can we get them into the system as quickly as possible? So we may have to send them a new patient intake, and that makes sense, right? There's files and medical records that have to be sent over. But really, at the end of the day, how can we get in there as quickly as possible? So it's been a little bit of a challenge, but it's been very fruitful as we've been able to get in there and navigate that process. It's really helped us to speed up that connections for patients.
That's great to hear. That's really fantastic. And I'll just share, Sue had to drop off the call, but Sue Friedman from Force did highlight an amazing partnering opportunity and experience with longevity in really understanding how patients need their communication presented. So just wanted to raise that in this question. So thinking about partnering with sponsor companies who are running clinical trials and sponsoring them at various sites, what in your estimation are the best practices that we should really follow in partnering, in actually establishing that relationship? They may, I think we know some of these intrinsically. Individually, we're very good at forming friendships, partnerships, but how do we, as companies, make these meaningful for patients and meaningful for your organization?
Well, frankly, I looked at the chart that you had presented earlier, Helen, looking at the different points through the drug development process. Really, I think is a really good start. Many times what I find is that people don't think the sponsors really want to hear from them. So just even showing that you have already identified places to start is a help. But also, of course, I keep leaning on this guidance, the patient-focused drug development. That's really asking companies to truly listen and not just pay lip service to this. And if people really understand that you're adhering to that guidance, and also I think that there has to be greater awareness of that guidance, frankly. But I think that guidance really helps to go a long way to say that this is your responsibility and this is what you want to do.
Helen, I think, and Dyan, there's really good points there. I think for our standpoint, all of that rings true. I think the bigger thing that we see is that earlier proactive outreach, right? As you can see, 10 months, right? This is not a moment in time. We always say to patients, the worst time to go looking for a clinical trial is when you need one, right? So I think the idea of helping through this journey, piecing this together and sharing information, and they become more and more comfortable, right? When CAR T first came out, right? There is, and I don't want to get too myeloma heavy or specific, but there was a lot of challenges around CAR-T and BCMA expression and getting tests and how do you navigate. And that has changed over 2 years, the inclusion, exclusion, the numbers and types of therapies and the targets. And the more we get these proactive outreach, and that's why we put patients through these cadences where it could be monthly, it could be every 5 or 6 months if their MGUS are smoldering and don't have an active need for this. But it's a way to, how do we engage earlier and often so they know? One of the things they say when they pick up is, what's new around me, right? Because they don't have that, that level of sophistication to go do that. So we need to bring it to them in a way that they can understand, right? It's a failure on our part as an industry that we can't get this information to them as efficiently and as friendly of a manner as they'd like to receive it.
Thank you, Brian. I really agree with you. Absolutely. Just from our perspective, I think there's a push and pull between patients engaging a patient and engaging that family, and then perhaps working with an organization, an advocacy organization, to promote awareness of the clinical study. Because when we think about that patient journey, you might not be, as a patient, you might not be ready for a clinical trial. And it might not actually be you who's ready for that trial. It might be your mother, or it might be your aunt or your neighbor. So you can share that information. But I think what's important for sponsor companies, and what we try to do, certainly from Bristol Myers Squibb, and I know a lot of other companies take this approach, is really, how do we provide information so people can consider that decision? They might not be ready this month. They might not be ready in 6 months. But if we don't begin that conversation, you can't just jump to it immediately, as you say. Kat, I'm not sure if you've got anything from your experience at Crohn's and colitis to add to here.
I think that, in my opinion, I think it's everyone has mentioned those valid points. Bringing the patient perspective in as early and often as possible is important. But also, I think patients may need to hear the challenges that healthcare providers are also facing in this, because I think it fosters more understanding of that process and hearing from each other. So I think bringing everyone together at the table, not siloed, is a good step in ensuring that all voices are heard and we understand the challenges and the different layers that exist. So in inflammatory bowel disease, for instance, one of the big things is, I'll pick on time commitment. That's one of those things. But it's the multiple procedures that they have to undergo multiple colonoscopies and endoscopies. It's very intrusive. And patients, it's a very, very heavy part of the patient experience in inflammatory bowel disease. So is there a way to make that easier? Is there, thinking outside the box, how can we tackle things of that nature and making that process less invasive and as much as possible? So maybe there isn't a quick solution, but understanding from that perspective, from the provider perspective, maybe the challenges in understanding what patient meets the right criteria. How can we start that conversation earlier rather than later, so that we're not down the line and going to the same providers and the same sites? Let's ensure we get diverse perspectives so that we touch on different communities of color and make sure that we're reaching those that need these resources. So I just wanted to add that, but I think I agree with everything everyone said.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So I've heard some themes of sustainability in relationships and partnerships, whether that's with the patients or with organizations. It's that early communication and constant communication, clear communication, and really understanding the burdens, really taking the time to understand, which all of your organizations do. So, I've just had a little note to say we've got to begin to wrap this up. So I'm going to just thank you all for all the work that you do in helping us understand the needs of the patient, the journey, and, taking this forward in a positive way, in a sustainable way. So we're always here. So thank you. Thank you all. Okay, so here's Kathy too. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you to all of our advocates for an incredibly informative session and some great information and sharing, and a lot of the examples and stories that you told really resonate, I know, with myself and a lot of those that are attending the sessions today. As we move into our next session, that's going to be focused on clinical trial sites and recruitment during our new COVID-19 environment. My colleague Candace Howell is going to be moderating that session. So again, thank you all, and we look forward to our next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.